Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I am Dr. Nancy Deutsch, professor at the University of Virginia's School of Education and Human Development, and the director of the Youth-Nex Center to promote effective youth development. And I am pleased to welcome you today to our panel, The Impact of the Pandemic and Racial Trauma on Emerging Adolescents. I am particularly excited about this panel because it is a collaboration amongst 5 of us. In addition to Youth-Nex, this panel is being hosted by SuccessBound, the To&Through project, CASEL, and AMLE, the Association for Middle Level Education. So this is an exciting collaboration between a group of organizations who all care about young adolescents. So to give you a quick overview of what the agenda will look like for today, we will be having a panel discussion that will be moderated by Dr. Jenny Nagaoka. And I apologize, Jenny, I just butchered your name as I said I was going to not do. We will have about 30 to 35 minutes of a panel discussion around questions that have been prepared ahead of time. And then there'll be about 10 to 15 minutes of question and answer from you all, the audience. And you can feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A function in Zoom. And I'm now going to introduce our moderator. So Jenny Nagaoka is the Deputy Director of the University of Chicago Consortium. Her research focuses on policy and practice in urban education reform. She is also the lead researcher on the To&Through project, which, as I mentioned, is one of the co-sponsors today. So I will now turn it over to Jenny.
Great, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Nancy. And actually, you did fine with my name the first time around too. But I'm really excited today for this panel. I mean, I think thinking about this coming school year and reflecting on the past school year is something that we've all been doing a lot of, and we're a couple months into the school year. So I'm delighted, and I'm particularly delighted about the 2 people we have on our panel today, Dr. Joanna Lee Williams and Dr. Rob Jagers. So Joanna Lee Williams is an associate professor in the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology at Rutgers University. Her scholarship focuses on understanding the role of race and ethnicity in individual and interpersonal contexts, and at broader levels of the ecology like classrooms during adolescence. This includes research on racial ethnic identity, racial ethnic diversity in adolescent friendship networks, and social network equity in diverse middle school classrooms. And I'm also going to introduce Dr. Jagers, who's the CASEL's Vice President of Research. Among his various CASEL duties, Dr. Jagers is leading the work with partner districts to explore how social and emotional learning can be leveraged to promote equitable learning environments and equitable development outcomes for students from historically underserved groups. He has a particular interest in participatory approaches to SCL research and practice and their implications for the civic development of children and youth. And from there, I'll start asking some questions of our panel. So I think one of the big things that we wanted to talk about was thinking about this coming school year. And with the return to in-person school, I wanted to ask our panel about what you think the most important thing or things for schools to be working on during this school year. And how do we think about this year, not just as what was lost during remote learning, which I think there's been a lot of conversation around learning loss, but really to be focusing more on what students have learned over the past year and a half during the pandemic, during this year where I think there's been a significantly more focus on racial justice and equity across the country. And I know, Rob, would you like to get us started?
Sure. So first of all, thank you for inviting me to be a participant on the panel. Very much appreciate the opportunity, and I'm glad to be in conversation with Joanna, who is a good colleague and an excellent scholar in this area. So part of the transition back to in-person school, I think, really has to consider the reality that young people have been out of the school context, and adults have been out of the school context for a substantial period of time. And so as they move back into that space, relationships become an important part of an adjustment that is required both for the young people as well as the adults to really reconnect in person versus online or via other media, and to be with one another in close proximity, transitioning to and from school, in and out of classes, in the public spaces in schools and the like, with all of the additional public health concerns that still obtain. That's an important key element is in the transition back, but it is also the case that while young people and adults were not in the school environment, learning was occurring both online in terms of the core academic content, but then of course, everyone having to negotiate their local context. And some of that context included, supplemental educational services out of school time, for example, but also young people assuming different types of responsibilities in the home environment, in the community environment, that certainly taught them about rights and responsibilities that they have that were different than the roles they might have assumed had we not been in the pandemic. And I'll pause there and turn it over to my colleague, Joanna.
Thank you, Rob. And thanks as well for having me. I'm glad to be here. I want to go back a little bit to what schools were like pre-pandemic, because I think it's important to remember that not all schools were necessarily meeting the needs, the developmental needs of young adolescents. And so I had the opportunity to be part of a committee that was sponsored by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And we worked on a report that was published in 2019 called The Promise of Adolescents, Realizing Opportunity for All Youth. We focused in one of the chapters on the education system. And as I look back on the recommendations we made then in the summer of 2019, I think some of them are, still have really important value now. So a couple of those include things like making sure, for example, that schools are emphasizing, knowledge that goes beyond academic content. So early adolescence in particular is a time when young people, they have developmental needs for agency and exploration. It's a time where we can scaffold things like decision-making, for example, and other aspects of social and emotional competence. So I think thinking about now more than ever, that being an important part of what we bring into the curricular experiences for students, so that we're meeting their needs for, again, exploration, decision-making, identity, and self-reflection, bringing those in to the intersection with what we might consider more traditional formal academic content. Another recommendation that we made then that I think is still critical now and perhaps even more important is to protect the overall health and well-being of each student. So thinking about the ways in which schools provide not only, opportunities for formal learning, but as Rob was alluding to, they also become resources that support the, social and emotional and mental well-being needs of youth. So when youth were not necessarily having access to that through schools, I think, for some, particularly those who were particularly vulnerable to mental health challenges, it became more stark that they no longer have direct access to supportive adults who might facilitate connections to some of those resources. So thinking about making sure that we're intentional about supporting health and well-being needs of youth And then finally, I think a through thread that, in the context of the pandemic, as well as thinking about the ways in which issues of race and racism and structural oppression have been part of the national conversation that youth have been, kind of leading on. Another recommendation that we had was thinking about how are we being intentional about making sure students see themselves represented in schools, that their identities are being affirmed, that the adults that they see in the school are people who they can relate to, that the curricular materials are ones that they can relate to. So it's an opportunity, I think about transformation in general, because going back to business as usual, it wasn't necessarily working for so many kids before the pandemic, that the opportunities that, this pause has afforded allow us to think about how do we really critically meet these developmental needs of our young people.
Great, thank you. I think it's really, it's a super good point. And I think, one of the things I think you're both bringing up too is how much of what schools also need to be doing is about relationships, and building a sense of belonging, so that, and I think I think Joanna, your point about how what happened over the past year and a half, to sort of like school was not working for students before, but I think now more than ever, there's a lot of things that are tremendously important right now, and it covered made clearer a lot more things that were going on in the past. But can you talk, can either you talk about, or both of you talk a little bit more about why this part about relationships and belonging is particularly important during adolescence and early adolescence, and what it is that things that schools can do to really help build a stronger sense of belonging, and what does it actually mean to have a sense of belonging in school?
I'm happy to jump in, and maybe I'll take the first part and pass along the second part of the question to Rob. But in early adolescence, we know that peer relationships are beginning to become more intense and more complex relative to earlier periods of life, and even relative to what happens in adulthood. Part of that has to do with the way that young adolescents are developing sort of holistically, but in particular, there are aspects of physical and neurobiological development that kind of amplify young people's sensitivity to social information. And so connections to peers and feedback from peers can be really rewarding. Like there can be like biochemical reactions where it feels good to be around your friends. That same kind of social sensitivity can also make it challenging. So, the feelings just can become a little bit more intense. So there's increased sensitivity on the one hand to affirming social relationships, but also to social exclusion. I mentioned before, it's a time where there are increases in needs around autonomy. Young people tend to spend more time with their peers and friends, and changes that happen at the middle school transition in school structure and sometimes school climate can also sort of intensify the ways in which young people experience peer relationships. Peer relationships provide important opportunities to support, developing skills around communication, to practice conflict resolution, to practice, making decisions together. In the best of scenarios, peer relationships can support young people's developing sense of empathy and tolerance and belonging, as we mentioned. And it can also give them opportunities to start practicing, things that we know are important in adulthood, things like collaboration and, competition and growing intimacy. So it's a really critical and interesting and dynamic time where relationships with other same age peers become central, but relationships with adults are also still critically important. So we know that, in adolescence and across adolescence, peer relationships may be more central to the kind of day-to-day engagement of young people, but that doesn't make relationships with adults any less important, and adults can become important resources for thinking about fostering either holistic settings where all young people can feel affirmed and feel like they belong. And then they can, in really sort of low-level informal ways, like noticing, their students, for example, saying hi, learning something personal about the students that they work with, that can also foster a sense of kind of connectedness for young people in school settings.
I would absolutely agree, and was going to and will continue to kind of elaborate a little bit on the issue of adults, because Joanna, your point is very well taken, that the developmental wants and needs of young people and early adolescents are in many respects responded to and facilitated through the adult relationships that you allude to. And in school settings, it is the adults who have the responsibility to begin to set up the kinds of structures, the kinds of programs, learning opportunities, et cetera, that can leverage the peer relationships that, as you correctly point out, are so very central to young people's sense of identity, belonging, agency, and the like, to minimize the kinds of the potential adult youth friction that can occur as young people assert that autonomy, assert their identity, to give them the space and supports in order to become increasingly mature in their role as emerging leaders of their school and their community. And then, as you suggested, there are certainly, programmatic kinds of things that can be done, leveraging academic content and project-based learning settings, youth participatory action research, as ways of facilitating the kinds of peer relationships that you discussed in your comments about young people and their developmental niche. The other thing is for schools to begin to provide leadership opportunities. So, for example, participatory budgeting, young people participating on school boards, and the like, have all been the kinds of activities that have allowed young people to see themselves and their peers as leaders and to have voice and choice in the educational experiences that they have.
Great, thank you both. So Joanna, you're an author on a recent report from the National Scientific Council on Adolescents. So it's on the intersection of adolescent development and anti-Black racism. So one thing that the report highlights is how key social contexts of adolescence can shape healthy development and define experiences for racism for Black youth. Can you say a bit more about what schools can do to foster healthy development and promote resilience among Black youth?
Sure. Well, I think it's important to start by noting that in some ways, schools are really the largest youth serving institution in our country. And so they hold a lot of potential for promoting anti-racism and facilitating positive development for youth. They also hold great potential for harm as well in those same spaces because youth are spending so much time there. So one of the things that we focus on in the report, and it's reflected in the title, is how, when we think about core developmental needs of adolescents, things like, a sense of identity and belonging, a sense of agency and opportunities for exploration, we ask the question, how does that intersect with experiences of racism and anti-Black racism in particular for Black youth? And what does that look like in settings where youth spend a lot of time? So, we document some of what we know about the research on Black youth related to disparities in discipline, disparities in opportunities for advanced learning, and those things that I think are well known and sort of well-worn statistics. And then we also focused on, if we think about centering developmental needs, then what would the science say that we should do in order to mitigate some of those challenges? So part of that starts with opportunities to promote and affirm positive identities for Black youth. That includes positive racial identities, but also identities more holistically. I think, for all of us, our identities are multidimensional, and having a complex multidimensional sense of yourself is really important for all young people. We hone in on opportunities related to what Rob was just talking about, So whether it be through curricular activities, formal curriculum, or sort of extracurricular activities, promoting the skill of being able to kind of critically analyze issues of injustice is something that can be done, in the middle grades with young adolescents, so that they, are developing an understanding of issues that go beyond kind of the ways in which we often get, sort of triggered and uncomfortable when we think about like interpersonal racism. Like we may be worried about saying the wrong thing, or we may, have been hurt by a personal experience. And that's important, that can impact youth's well-being, but having the skill to sort of analyze, how racial injustice happens and how we as, how young people can contribute to dismantling of some of those systemic injustices is something that can be really beneficial for adolescents, and continue to sort of work hand in hand with supporting positive identities. Of course, we want to reduce the well-documented racial disparities in things like push out of classroom settings and out of schools that happen through discipline. We want to push young people into spaces where, they have opportunities to access rigorous curriculum. And some of that can be done through investments in educator training around interventions that work to reduce some of these disparities, interventions that also promote competence in, culturally sustaining and culturally relevant pedagogy. All of those, I think, can make an important difference in educational settings in particular. I think it's important, and many schools are doing this and they know this, to look specifically in your district at data to recognize where disparities are occurring that have particular impacts for Black youth, because without knowing, and so this means like disaggregating data by race and then also by other important dimensions, things like gender, social class, for example, to understand which communities are being potentially left out or missed or most negatively impacted, helps to think about targeting solutions. One other one that I'll mention too is if we focus on allocating resources for culturally responsive social emotional learning programs, I think that is, a critical resource for supporting holistic development, but then also like asking the question, is it working? If we're interested in supporting the development of Black youth and we decide, maybe this social emotional learning curriculum might be something we want to use in our school, well, then we have to actually stop and ask and look to see, is it, having any sort of particular benefits for the Black youth in our school community?
Great, thank you. I know, Rob, is there anything that you would like to add about what schools can be doing to be fostering healthy development and resilience, particularly among Black youth?
I think Joanna hit on a wide array of options that schools might utilize. And of course, I would double down on the culturally relevant social and emotional learning comment that I think is in some ways foundational, given the ways in which many young people have been underserved as it relates to who they are and who they hope to be. So I would certainly double down on that recommendation. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Yeah, so Rob, this is kind of a little bit related, but a lot of your work has examined civic engagement among Black and Latino middle graders. So can you say a little bit about why providing these kind of opportunities for civic engagement is so important for middle graders, and also like what schools can do to foster growth and development of civic engagement in the school setting or adjacent to the school setting?
Yeah, I think that, many of the questions and responses, I think, are all, interconnected in a lot of ways. The issue of civic engagement, I think, is foundational to a thriving democracy. And so civic engagement would kind of conceptualize schools, not unlike the way that my colleague Joanna talks about them, as a microcosm of the broader society, a place where young people begin to understand rights and responsibilities, how to interact effectively with people who are similar and people who are different and different on a lot of different dimensions, and are offered the opportunity to potentially, engage in the co-development or co-construction of those environments, especially as they age into adolescence with increased autonomy, agency, belonging, the kinds of key factors that we've been talking about. And so civic engagement, conceptualizes schools again as a microcosm and classrooms as communities and places where young people can engage in potential collaborative problem solving, which in many respects is foundational to a thriving democracy. And so schools provide opportunities to begin to practice those rights and responsibilities that will be important as our young people become the next generation of informed and engaged adults, and push forward on trying to create a more just and equitable society.
Yeah, I mean, just as a quick follow-up, and I'm kind of curious, like with the last year and a half, and particularly with like the racial reckoning that's happening, and it feels like there's a growing set of opportunities for young people to engage. Do you feel like what has changed, or you see new opportunities for civic engagement for young people now?
Well, I think there are new opportunities. It is, historically, it has been young people who have led,
Right.
All the various kind of social change movements that have helped the society improve and attempt to better realize its promise as a thriving democracy. So I do think those opportunities exist, and they'll continue to exist because we do have an imperfect union at this point. And so how do you move to a place where you can deliberate, determine what is the best way forward with the interest of all the diverse actors, their well-being being considered, and come to the solution that is in the best interest of the community. Those are challenges that will continue to confront us as adults, but certainly young people as they achieve adult status.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. So Joanna, I have a question for you. I mean, a lot of, you've talked a little bit about your research, but a lot of your research has explored racial, ethnic identity and friendship networks. So when we think about building a sense of community and belonging in the classroom for adolescents, peers are clearly an important part of the picture. But what can schools do to promote positive peer relationships?
Yeah, so that is an important question. I think it's one that is often, particularly relevant for thinking about early adolescence. Mm-hmm. So I'll start just with a little bit, again, of kind of basic developmental knowledge. Early adolescence in particular is when we often see, it's like the peak time for what we often refer to as cliques. And the term clique has sort of a negative connotation, but really it is a peer group. Usually it's about 3 to 9 members large. They can be fairly informal. There's a lot of flexibility and turnover, again, particularly in the middle grades years, but they take on increasing importance in early adolescence compared to, say, like high school students. So they tend to decline in importance over time. And cliques or friendship groups are really central for adolescents as they are working on the tasks of identity development. They also meet the central developmental need for acceptance and belonging. So I think, educators understanding that the emergence of, what sometimes feel like these exclusionary spaces and some of the, sort of the ups and downs that go with clique memberships across a school year, like recognizing the normative aspects of those is important for supporting positive peer relationships in general, and recognizing that, these kinds of peer groups, there tends to be a little bit more conformity pressure, a little bit more coercion than you see in, say, a friendship between 2 students that, sort of might be a different and stronger bond. So with that being said, I think it's capitalizing on adolescents' needs for having these strong social connections is one place to start. One of the interventions that I often point to focused on understanding kind of the landscape of peer networks in middle schools. And what the researchers did was they asked students a basic kind of social influence question, like who have you wanted to spend time with, or who have you paid the most attention to in the past week or something like that. And they identified students in the school who were considered to be sort of socially influential based on this pretty straightforward question. They randomly selected some of those influencers along with other students who just, may have had more average ratings. And they, to Rob's point, they then involved those students in leading in problem solving related to school climate. So it was the group of young people in the school who then were given an opportunity through a semi-structured curriculum to identify social issues in the school, and then to identify ways to address those social issues. And so the students could come up with anything. It might be like a social media campaign. I know in one of the examples, some students decided that they would get those, like rubber bracelets that had positive messages on them, and they handed them out to all the students in their school. And you had kids who other students were looking to as leaders in their school, reinforcing norms around positive relationships and what it means to be sort of kind and to be connected with one another. And it was found to reduce issues around kind of hostile climate and other negative instances of bullying. So I think that's something where you're, thinking about who are the people that, other kids are looking to as leaders in our school. How can we then use them to change some of the norms? And that can be sort of school-wide. I think outside of that kind of approach, in more informal settings during the day, as well as in addition to formal classroom settings, having students have opportunities to sort of voice their internal questions and monologues about peer relationships is important. In my interviews with middle school students, they have a lot going on as they're trying to make meaning of social relationships. And oftentimes they've got, sort of assumptions about what their peers are doing that are not actually mapped onto reality. I've studied this in the context of, issues of race and cultural diversity, but it's true around other, kinds of behaviors. Students tend to overestimate what their peers are doing in terms of involvement in certain behaviors. And they also tend to, in my experience, overestimate the other students' willingness to cross boundaries of difference. So giving students opportunities to kind of talk through some of their uncertainties and anxieties and express them, so that students realize, oh, it's not just me who is thinking this, can go a long way in helping to start to normalize that, like, we are all individuals in this community, and we all have questions, we all have uncertainties about how to connect with others across boundaries of difference, and then we can work together to try and do that a little bit more. In formal curricular settings, the last thing I'll say too is that, opportunities for cooperative learning in ways that are structured or semi-structured, so that students are not gravitating just to their friends for, say, group work, can also help build relationships. So I think teachers have a lot of expertise in understanding how to use cooperative opportunities for connection. And, if you add, for example, before you dive into the formal activity that's the focus of the class, maybe there's an informal icebreaker question that allows students who might not know each other very well to learn something about their peers. Little things like that can also make a big difference.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful. I noticed there was a comment in the Q&A box about how peer relationships have really suffered a great deal, especially with remote learning and people just not being able to interact each other. And was commenting about it's almost like the students forgot how to get along. So given the experience of everybody, but particularly young people during the pandemic, where people just weren't able to interact. I mean, I guess, what are your thoughts on what may have happened or what we can do going forward to really help to rebuild around relationships and learning how to get along, because clearly that's a big part of what adolescence is about, is figuring out how to do that as well.
Yeah. Well, I think for many adolescents, and there's variability and unevenness in access to digital technology. So I would say for many adolescents, and we have some data from young people who are 14 and up, they were able to maintain social connections through digital technology. On the one hand, that is wonderful, like the opportunity to stay connected when you can't, be in person with your friends was, I think, a critical resource for so many young people. But not everybody had access to the kinds of digital, technologies that support social connections. And if, say, for example, you were a student who had just moved into a new school community and you didn't know anybody, or something like that, or you were a student who was, perhaps dealing with social anxiety and you were struggling to make those connections, you might have lost some of those opportunities. The other piece of digital media connection is that, it's easier to, in some ways, create new identities and to, perform your identity in different ways. There's a little bit of, anonymity that can go into those spaces. So youth could then be multiple versions of themselves. And so imagine a little bit of the hesitation and, awkwardness when all of a sudden it's like, oh, now I'm going back to, the person that everybody knew me before because I'm going to be in person. And I think, again, as a skill set, young people are developing the skills to engage with one another socially. Even though they spend a lot of time with their peers and they can be really excited, there are still, skills that they need to practice in these relationships. So I think creating additional opportunities for young people to reflect on those and, to practice some of those skills, rather than assuming just because we've now opened the doors and people can come back in, automatically everything will go back to being the same. I have not talked to young people about this, but I'd be curious to hold conversations with youth about the transition from their relationships that they took online for a year and a half and how they sort of saw themselves in those spaces versus what it felt like then to go back to being in person. So asking some of those questions so youth can share some of the uncertainties that might have gone with that transition, I think is a good starting place to then understanding, well, what are the specific needs that follow from, where youth are in this transition period.
Great, thank you. So given where we're at in time, I just probably going to try to wrap things up, but I think just to conclude us, if you could just, if this is for both of you, to state really briefly just about what do you think the most important thing for practitioners or people working with young people to be thinking about the developmental stage of adolescence? I think we've hit on a lot of things, but just to kind of give the quick pithy thing for people to walk away with. Rob, do you want to get us started?
Sure. I'll take a shot and I'll be quick. Listening to young people, talking with them rather than at them, and giving them opportunities for both voice and choice in the co-construction of their learning environments.
Great, thank you. I think that is truly important. Joanna?
Yeah, so I would completely agree with what Rob said and just add that, to me, what's most exciting about adolescence is that it's such an important period of promise. I think adolescents have so much to offer as they're developing, increasing capacity for things like problem solving, and they bring to that their creativity and their lived experiences. It's a really dynamic period. I'll go back to the title of the National Academy's report. We call it the promise of adolescence because we know this is such a period of increasing flexibility and change and, malleability. Not that adolescents are passively receiving information, but, there's an opportunity for really supporting positive trajectories through listening and engaging with young people. So they're not just, larger children and they're not just small adults. Adolescence is really this sort of unique period of opportunity that we can learn from and work with youth. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate the people who've put questions in. We're going to be opening it up to more questions. So please as you've been listening, if you have any questions you'd like to ask our panel, please drop them into the Q&A box. But I will get us started with some of these questions. So the first one I'm going to ask is from Marv Hoffman, who mentions how anecdotally he's been hearing from teachers that they're seeing more behavior problems in their classrooms since the return to in-person instruction. And he just wanted to hear a little bit more about your impression about this and what teachers could do to address behavior problems.
Sure, I'll take a shot and then obviously invite my colleague. That would make sense, right? Given the scenario that we just sketched with the social media connection in the absence of being in person, everyone is coming back into a space that they haven't been in for a substantial period of time and bringing all of the excitement, both the positive and negative emotions into those environments. And so it is a process of kind of sorting things out and relearning how to, quote unquote, do school, but hopefully do school in a way that is different and is more supportive of the developmental wants and needs of young people in that particular period. So some of the recommendations that Joanna offered, I think, are germane to how to get back into doing school, but doing school differently.
I'll just remind us that we said the same thing at the start of the pandemic when schools started shutting down. Obviously, that was a dramatic change, but I think there was, we brought attention to, students are no longer engaged and, all of these other things, or students are, not behaving like they should. So again, at any transition, we need to leave room for all of the uncertainty and anxiety and excitement that goes along with a transition. And even though for most adolescents, they've been doing traditional school for a long period of time prior to the pandemic, they experienced, a monumental shift in the world that I think, adolescence is a great time of resilience. And I think most of our young people have been able to cope, but we have to think about, for an individual youth, what was their experience of the pandemic like in terms of loss and opportunity, in terms of, heightened levels of anxiety or uncertainty, or in terms of, social isolation. So that's going to vary. I think understanding where you are in that transition and finding out from them what their needs are and how school might feel different to them after having been out of the physical space for so long is a good place to start.
One of the things that I would just add very quickly, it appears that many of the adults have forgotten how to behave as well. And, adults need to realize that young people are watching. So in some ways, some of the unfortunate contestation that we see going on around the country is really signaling to young people they're modeling a certain pattern of behavior, but it's also signaling to segments of the community that they don't belong, that they don't need to be affirmed and the like. So we can't separate what goes on with young people from what goes on in the broader society.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's actually a real quick question asking if you could share the name of the school climate related curriculum that was mentioned earlier. I do not know specifically which one it was. So if one of the two of you could say it, that'd probably be helpful. I think a lot of people wanted to know what it was because it sounded really great.
I may have been talking about, I mentioned in the peer sort of network intervention that it impacted school climate, and they used something called the Roots curriculum. It was embedded into the project. I will see if I can find a link to the Roots curriculum. But the work was by Elizabeth Paluck, P-A-L-U-C-K. Betsy Paluck and her colleagues, did the intervention in about 60 middle schools. And they used the Roots curriculum to structure that opportunity for young people.
Great. Yeah, and I think there's another good question kind of more about the adult side of the equation. So as we're thinking about supporting our teachers to better support our youth of color, do you have any suggestions about how to bring along more hesitant staff to adjust their perspectives on equity, recognizing the value of their students' strengths and reframing them from deficit-based views. I mean, I think that is like one of the key parts of this whole change process. And we talk about like what youth need, but adults need to change even more so than like, so they can actually be supportive of students.
Yeah, so I think this is an ongoing challenge. And right now, as Rob was pointing to, we are in a moment nationally where people have, challenged, even our right to talk about issues of injustice in school. I think for educators, it's important to remember that most educators become educators because they care deeply about students and about students learning, and they want to support, they have really good intentions. So always holding that at the center. And they also have a lot on their plate. I do think as adults, we all could be, we all should see ourselves as lifelong learners. We could all be doing more to support and understand the experiences of marginalization. For myself, in terms of, educating, say, pre-service teachers, some of the things that I've done in the past is, one, helping them understand. So the word racism can trigger a lot of anxiety, and, or even just talking about race can trigger like, I don't want to say the wrong thing or anything like that. So it can make people uncomfortable. I found that helping students understand racism at a more structural level and the institutional level, going beyond, to see it, how it shows up in policies and practices, beyond just, an individual, engaging in say a microaggression, is helpful in kind of opening up a conversation where, people aren't sort of leading with fear over, making an inappropriate comment. And so it's one pathway into that conversation. The other piece that I think is important is encouraging educators, on top of all of the things that our educators do so well, to think about ongoing reflection in their interactions with students. So, being in a classroom with students, or being in a school with students throughout the day, there can be those students who just kind of get under your skin from time to time, or there can be, a knee-jerk reaction that you have to a student because, you may in the moment feel like, well, that student is kind of interfering with my own goals for getting through and, imparting wisdom to the other students in the class. But reflecting on those moments to understand, what are my own assumptions about, say, what good behavior looks like in a classroom? What are my own assumptions about what respect looks like in a classroom? And where did those come from in terms of my own educational experiences? Doing some of that deep reflection at the individual level can also be a really important tool for helping to kind of process and then recover from interactions with students who, again, disproportionately tend to be Black and Brown students, as well as, male students of all races and students with disabilities of all races tend to be, disproportionately impacted by, teachers around like discipline, for example. So I would say understanding and starting the conversation by understanding structural injustices, because we can then think about how can we change policies and practices in our school, and then also working on deep self-reflection.
I would absolutely agree, and would add that some of the developmental experiences or learning experiences that are more cooperative, collaborative, et cetera, can position an educator as a co-learner about the young people and about his or herself in the context of academic rigor being applied. So project-based learning, for example, where the educator actively participates in the construction of the project, for example, around some local concern that young people have, can help the young people address the concern, and thereby they see the relevance of the academic material, but it also helps all of the group members, to include the adult, to learn about one another and their shared concerns and potential solutions.
Great, thank you. So we also have a request to hear more specific examples of what socio-emotional instruction and support in school could look like. And so wanting to know, like, should this be integrated into all aspects of classroom life, Or are you referring to like health and wellness classes or access to counseling resources? So kind of like, how does this look like and where does it live inside of a school?
The short answer would be, and obviously I would invite Joanna to weigh in as well. But the short answer is all of the above. That in many respects, what social and emotional learning is intended to introduce into the learning environment is the reality that we are not just cognitive, right? School, yes, you are there to learn content, but you also there as a human being who has social experiences in that environment, both peer and adult relationships, and you have feelings about yourself and about others, and all of that is operating in the learning environment. So we should, as human beings, these things are always attendant in whatever interactions we have, and realizing that learning is a relational process, right? Then we should be more attentive to the social, emotional, and the cognitive simultaneously. So there are evidence-based programs that people utilize, and they are of various sorts. Some are skill development programs that tend to be more appropriate for elementary school. They're more community development and social norms and processes oriented programs. And then there are, the kinds of practices that we've been discussing here that invite young people to be more active participants in the learning process. So they're of all sorts, and there are also universal secondary and tertiary social and emotional learning supports that are also part of a multi-tier social support approach. And that a lot of that is on the CASEL website, the evidence-based programs, for example.
Yeah, and I feel like we actually probably should come up with we've come up with a lot of different references and websites that we probably should share at the end. So there's also a question about how you draw youth into the conversation, and is there a particular set of strategies or techniques that really help to attract youth to be participating in conversations, and I think more generally?
So in my experience, I think in the context of a school setting, there's obviously, formal roles that teachers have where they, some youth may feel very comfortable talking with teachers and others may feel less comfortable. But I think, to the extent possible, if we're talking about in schools, educators who are in schools, creating opportunities to get to know students beyond their, academic performance or beyond their presence in an academic learning space is important. So in the social psychology world, there are some brief interventions, so identity affirmation or values affirmation interventions, where essentially you can ask students basic questions like, here's a list of 10 to 15 things like, family or community or race and culture or religion, pick the two that are most important to you and tell me about why. In the formal experimental research, when young people were able to do this, it was in some ways it was about reducing stereotype threat, and there was evidence that it was supportive of positive academic outcomes. But I think the important part of the story is the mechanism. And so the theoretical mechanism is that students were then sort of feeling seen and heard by their teachers beyond any sort of stereotypical labels. They weren't just, seen as say a Black student or, a male student or, whatever the identity label is. They felt like their teachers, knew something about them personally. So I think educators can do that kind of work. There's a relatively new tool that is a free digital tool for teachers to help build relationships with students. It's called Along, and the website is along.org. And essentially what it does is they have created a clearinghouse of these kinds of connection questions that teachers can use. And it's this fun digital, almost like back and forth journal, or, it's almost, it's beyond, it's a level above a text message because students can put in videos and whatever, but it gives prompts for teachers to ask their students to get to know something more about them. And so you can think about using tools like that. I found as a researcher, honestly, when I've come into middle schools to ask students to talk with me about issues of, race and friendships and, school diversity and things like that, depending on the student, many of them have said things like, oh, we never get to talk about these topics. So we really appreciate being able to actually share our opinions with somebody. Not every student, because some students are the opposite and they're like, oh, I'm too scared. Like, again, I don't want to say the wrong thing. So why are you asking me these? But that's the luxury of being somebody as an outsider. So, but thinking about how then do we use maybe older peers and, peer buddy systems to facilitate the connections to adults. It can be a challenge if you're outside of the school actually to bring young people into the table because there's a lot of, gatekeeping and barriers and things like that. But in the schools, I think when youth can talk about themselves, then you have an opportunity to create those relationships and spaces where they feel they are part of what's going on. And then, beyond that, it's giving them opportunities to weigh in on things that are important to them in their school community and beyond.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I'm trying to be mindful of time here too. I think there's a lot of good questions, but I think these are all questions that are worthy of a much longer answer than we probably have time for. But I really appreciate, first I want to thank our panelists. I feel like I've learned so much. It's something I've read and researched a lot about, but I feel like every time I hear you talk, I learned so much. So thank you so much for spending this time with us. And I also want to thank everybody on behalf of our 5 co-sponsors of this panel. I want to thank everybody who is listening in this afternoon and taking the time to hear from us. So thanks, and hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your day. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.